Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to our
Hi.
panel and discussion. So glad to be here with you all today. Apologies for if you can hear the airplane in the background. I am sort of outside. This is the Reckoning Tennessee Writers on 2020 panel, and we're here to celebrate and read a little bit from this book. Yay. The cover art is by Laura Baisden of Camp Nevernice, who's a locally based, Nashville-based printmaker, and you can find much more of her work at campnevernice.com, I believe. So I'm just going to say a few words. Well, first, let me just introduce briefly, and then I'll reintroduce everybody on our panel today. We have Margaret Littman.
Hi.
Nicholas Bush.
How's it going?
Delaney Gray.
Hi.
Of course, I'm Susannah Feltz. And so, yeah, I'm so pleased to be with these folks today. They all have pieces in the book. And a little bit about how this came to be. The Tennessee Arts Commission put out a call for projects to be supported by a COVID Arts Resilience Grant. And so we immediately, seeing that call for proposals in, I think, Metro Arts newsletter, we immediately thought, oh, wow, this would be a great opportunity to do a special project. And I think just immediately we had the idea of an anthology of writing around the year that was 2020. And so we pretty quickly put together a proposal. It was accepted, and we were off to the races. And so sort of early in 2021, we began soliciting material submissions for the book. And one of the key pieces of this project was that everybody, all the writers who were included in the book, were paid. So this was a way to fund artists during a year that was difficult for all of us in different ways, but hard on artists. So we received upwards of 140 submissions, I think almost 150. And from that, we ended up choosing, I think, 33. So it took several months of reading. I read every submission and had a few other people read along with me. Some of the, once we started narrowing it down, and came up. It was hard. There was a lot of really interesting work, and one thing we wanted to make sure of was that we had work representing a wide range of the state of Tennessee. And I was really pleased in the end, that we did have work from about 8 or 9 different localities. So Memphis, Spring Hill, Murfreesboro, Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, Johnson City, Cleveland, and maybe a few others that I'm forgetting, Clarksville, I think. So the state was well represented, is well represented by what's in the book. And we've got more creative nonfiction than kind of anything else, but a lot of really good poetry and a nice handful of short stories, fiction. And if you have the book, or if you end up getting the book, you can see what's what in the table of contents. There's little letters, C and F or F or P, that designate what genre a piece is, if it's not immediately apparent. So I'm just really pleased with how it turned out, and I thought I would start us off today by reading a little bit from our introduction. And then I'm going to introduce Nick, and he's going to read a piece, and we're going to go from there with Delaney and then Margaret. And then we'll have time for some questions and discussion. So I'll just start. I'm going to read just a few little pieces of the introduction. In September 2020, as COVID-19 cases soared and my daughter attended 7th grade via a laptop in her bedroom, I had several overgrown hedges removed from my front yard. We replaced them with native plants, the better to attract pollinators once spring and summer came around again. My neighborhood strolls revealed what I already knew. I was participating in a pandemic trend. Many of us made our plots of earth greener, brighter, and more butterfly and bee friendly while we stayed home and waited, worried, hoped. My work from home office windows face that front yard, and for months I've observed folks making their way down my quiet street at all hours of the day, with dogs on leashes or pushing strollers or on rollerblades next to their scootering kids. So many people, I often thought. Did the pandemic really bring us onto our feet and onto the sidewalks? Or could all these passersby have been here all along, just hidden from my view by those two tall hedges? Perhaps after a year of challenges like no other, you've been asking similar questions. Was life always this way? Was I always this way? Or has something shifted inside and out? Both and, most likely. My Nashville neighborhood, its friendly people, its walkable streets, its sights and sounds, felt life-saving to me in 2020, as did a couple of really good TV shows. Witnessing the passersby soothed my soul, a kind of slow drip sustenance. A sustenance the writers here find too, at a time when every variety of lack and loss was on vivid display. We have hot lunches now and kiss during breaks, grateful our kisses are real, not virtual, writes Lisa Dordahl in Virus Days. In Orbit, Delaney Gray gets goosebumps while gazing at the impossible man-made phenomenon of the International Space Station in the night sky far above. While mourning John Prine and so much more in The Clarity That Comes with Hard Times, Margaret Littman writes, suffering has been unevenly distributed during this crisis, but the collective nature of this terror might mean that we will remember together what we move on from too quickly alone. Perhaps we'll finally take in what we know but nevertheless manage to put out of our minds, that life is precious and finite, that we cannot know when the end is coming, that what is beautiful and just and true deserves our focus far more than what's annoying or inconvenient. Perhaps, like me, you can now identify a robin's call or a plant previously unfamiliar to you. We've developed fresh gratitude for cherished constants in our lives, our local establishments still alive and serving up kicks of espresso, our friendships and our parks and our pups and the presence of the natural world. The writers of Reckoning share words that beg reflection from each of us. What did you cling to? Where did you find a sense of calm or discovery? What pushed you to the edge and why? And how have you been guided to change? In many cases, we're more ourselves and more committed to work for the collective good. In the face of breakdown, we are forced to ask how our structures are failing us and how we must evolve to offer sustenance to all. As Margaret Littman writes in Of Glass and Gold, My Kintsugi Year, the essay that closes this collection, it can't all be put back together like it was before, and I learned I don't want it to be. There are countless lessons to be learned from the collective experience of 2020. Some have already been borne out, but it's really too early to know how this time will leave its prints on us. We'll metabolize and manifest the effects for years to come. After everything we've been through, a pandemic, tornadoes, a bitter fight for democracy, a nation confronting again its systemic racism and legacy of racial violence, and in Nashville, a Christmas bombing, it's a lot to, well, reckon with. I'll stop there. And thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Nick. Nick, I'm going to read your bio from the back. Let's see. Where are we? Okay. Nicholas Bush is an associate professor at Motlow State Community College who performs stand-up comedy and writes poetry and fiction. He co-edits the Mosaic Literary Magazine and is part of a team that manages a Nashville area open mic and poetry series. His work has appeared in Muse, Literary Yard, Baseball Bard, and 5-2 Poetry. So, warm welcome to Nick.
All right. Thank you, Susannah. So this poem I'm about to perform, Ode to Ida B. Wells, I originally wrote it for the Bloomsbury stage, which is the Bloomsbury stage, which is a quarterly storytelling event in Murfreesboro. And the theme for it was women's suffrage, because it was the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And so I wanted to try to find a story to tell. I ran across Ida B. Wells' story, and I was familiar with her. I knew she was involved in the women's movement, but I didn't realize how involved she was in women's suffrage. And so the more I read about her, the more I was like, this has to be a movie, but we'll start with the poem. So here we go. Ode to Ida B. Wells. 2020 hasn't been all bad. On May 5th, they honored Ida B. Wells with a Pulitzer given posthumously. I mean, 125 years late is better than never, I guess, but I would have rather it have been 35 years too late because, see, she died in 1931. She would have at least had a year to celebrate, I guess, but it shouldn't have come down to that. See, she shouldn't have had to write about Tennessee lynchings, and she shouldn't have had to hide out in New York while they burned the Memphis offices where she learned her investigative journalism techniques and published a newspaper she co-founded, ironically titled Free Speech. I mean, I guess it was ironic, but I'd rather talk about May 4th, 1884, 136 years before the previously mentioned posthumous Pulitzer, when she bought a first-class ticket on a train and when she refused to go to the back of the caravan and this sounds familiar, damn. And you already know how this ends. When she refused to give up her seat, it took the conductor and two other white men to drag her off the train and back into the streets. So you know she had something to say about her right to vote. She wouldn't just stand on the sidelines while other folks spoke. She joined what would later be the NAACP while still showing love to her own women's voting organization, the Alpha Club. And all that is cool, but her moment of truth came in 1913 when they organized a women's suffrage parade the day before Woodrow Wilson would take the stage at his inauguration. They said, Ida B, it's kind of dangerous what we're doing, and some folks might find it confusing if we protest a new Southern president and too many Black folks get seen. So can you do your thing quietly, less center stage and more behind the scenes? Ida B. Wells said, all right, then, well, you know, it's a team game, no time for clicks, so sometimes your star players got to ride the bench. And on March 3rd, 1913, everything went as planned. Ida B didn't stand out. In fact, she stood on the sidelines, not even marching, just watching with the crowd until the all-white Chicago delegation came through. Then Ida B jumped off the bench, said, yo, I'm calling my own play. I'm going into the game. Make way. She squeezed herself between two white women near the front and said, come on, don't look at me crazy. You know how I like to play. Now let's walk. Now, see, I'm a Black male, so I'd have been well if Ida B. Wells was just cool with the 15th Amendment that gave me the right to speak. But we wouldn't be well without the 19th Amendment that gave all Americans the right to speak. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still another 53 years before the Equal Rights Amendment, but that's another speech. And one of the biggest arguments against women's suffrage was that the family unit would suffer in age, but Ida B smashed that too because she got married and raised 4 kids while still changing the journalism, political, and nomenclature game, because she was also one of the first American women to get married and still keep her last name. Thank y'all very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was great. I love hearing you read that piece. It's amazing. It just wonderfully comes alive when spoken like that. I love it. All right, next is Delaney Gray, who lives in the Inglewood neighborhood of Nashville and has been a Tennessean for almost her entire life and is part of a very active WhatsApp group. Shares food sharing, food swapping. Just a little tidbit I decided to add in there. She loves Harry Potter and believes that left on base is the most important statistic in baseball. When she's not writing, she works at the Nashville office of Lyft Incorporated and spends her spare time in the kitchen with her husband, Austin, and 4 unimpressed cats. Warm welcome to Delaney.
Thank you. Thanks, Susannah. Thank you, Nick, also. That piece is so amazing. I'm sharing a flash nonfiction piece that I wrote in a flash nonfiction class that I took with Susannah in the fall as part of the Porch's programming. And this is called In Orbit. In orbit. I probably should have put on shoes. The asphalt is rough and cold on my feet, but we are rushing and I don't want to miss a second. My head tips all the way back as I gaze directly overhead where the International Space Station zooms in a perfectly straight path over a clear night sky. I marvel at the impossible man-made phenomenon hundreds of miles above and listen as doors slam and greetings are called, neighbors wandering out to join us in safely distant clusters at the corner of Sandy and Andrew. We're all gaping at the illuminated dot, surprisingly bright and noticeably different from the planets and plane lights that clutter the night. Passing cars slow to a crawl as their headlights land on a curious huddle of humans standing in the street, staring at the cosmos. This stargazing routine has been a periodic bright spot during the darkness of 2020, when we've been unmoored from any security or predictability. When the ISS detector app tells me there's going to be a particularly good angle or long pass by, I set alarms and spread the word to the neighborhood text thread. Sometimes it's several nights in a row, sometimes only once a month. Whenever the unmistakable beam of light appears, I get goosebumps. Those of us who are space station viewing veterans comment to each other, "That was a really good one," when the weather is clear and the travel path aligns with a break in the plentiful trees of Englewood. As the glowing spacecraft disappears from sight, we all head back into our respective homes, like children being called to bed at the end of a long summer night of play. I think to myself every time that I'll remember these nights for the rest of my life. I keep asking for a new way to describe the constant sensation of 2020. What's the word for being guilty, feeling guilty for being happy? Every morning, the New York Times newsletter reports that the world is a burning pit of crisis and despair. Yet we're tucked safely at home, cooking good food, with cats who have stopped being annoyed with us for being here all the time. My husband makes me laugh every single day. I miss my sisters. I miss movie popcorn, but this year has mostly been one of such peace and grace and gratitude. Some nights I watch an unfathomably far satellite carrying scientists and engineers who escaped Earth at the best possible time and wonder what they'd think if they could see me, a Tennessee speck of light and gladness.
Thank you so much. I love that. A Tennessee speck of light and gladness. We are all that at times. And there were so many pieces in this collection that really did go toward joy, or toward gratefulness and gratitude and wonder. And I really appreciated that. It was such a delight to read everyone's work. And Margaret Littman will close us out with the readings. She tells the stories of the people and the places of the South. And since moving back to Nashville, Margaret has acquired a cowboy boot collection, but not the ability to carry a tune. Her work has appeared in Preservation, Condé Nast Traveler, AARP, Real Simple, Entrepreneur, and elsewhere. And you can read more of her work at littmanwrites.com.
Thank you. Those are hard acts to follow. Those are both great pieces. This is Of Glass and Gold, my Kintsugi year. A special access card didn't allow me to skip the sorrow wrought by a suicide bomber. I didn't expect to need a press pass on Christmas morning 2020. Most journalists have a press pass, an ID card that helps them get past a bottleneck of gawkers to the experts so that they can get facts. While I have one before 2020, I didn't use it much. I don't cover breaking news often, and I'm not on a daily beat. When the year's tsunami of news started, I searched for mine, rifling through desk drawers in my Nashville office, emptying a yet unpacked duffel bag with notebooks and phone chargers. I eventually found the press pass tucked into a bookend on my desk. I clipped it into an old lanyard from the opening of the Tennessee State Museum that hung on my filing cabinet. Over the last 9 months of 2020, that laminated card with my smiley headshot staring out, oblivious to what was happening, accompanied me through one difficult reporting situation after another. Together, we walked through broken glass on Main Street after an EF3 tornado pulled roofs off homes and small businesses in East Nashville and Germantown in March. In May, we headed downtown, again glass crunching underfoot after civil unrest in the wake of George Floyd's murder. We walked past boarded up windows on Lower Broad, some from proactive protective measures, others concealing damage. We ducked under barricades trying to capture the intensity of the days, of the pain of systemic violence, of the brokenness of the city and the country that would last far longer than the broken windows. Later in the summer, I'd head downtown again to the People's Plaza protests. spending the golden dusk hours outside the Tennessee state capitol, where the only broken glass was that of the sun giving way to the stars. The protesters wrote local names, Daniel Hambrick and Jacques Clemens, along with nationally known victims of police brutality, in chalk on the sidewalk. It would rain and their names would wash away. I listened to them explain to passersby what they wanted, a conversation with Governor Bill Lee. All the while, my press pass was a mini invisibility shield, allowing me to skate past the barriers that stopped others. At least until August, when the Tennessee legislature passed a law making camping on state property a felony, essentially closing the autonomous zone altogether each night. On my drives home, I talk into a dictation app, dumping the notes from my brain in a Bluetooth stream of consciousness blast, trying to figure out how to distill it all. When I went back to edit, I saw the term press pass had been transcribed as depressed pass. Good job, artificial intelligence. For once, you truly got it right. On Christmas morning, I was fully hunkered down. With COVID infection rates high and temperatures low, there wasn't a lot of outdoor socializing. Yet, I wasn't feeling depressed. I spent Christmas Eve texting with a friend while watching some of the 4-part Heaven's Gate docuseries I had saved for an uninterrupted stretch of time. We talked about God and cults and faith and hope. It was 19 degrees, a winter temperature that is cold anywhere, but particularly unusual in Nashville. I planned to take the day off, holed up with my quarantine rescue yellow lab, Raja. I felt secure with a refrigerator full of fresh ingredients for making traditional Jewish Christmas Chinese American food that I'd normally wait in a long line to eat. I'd binge the remaining Heaven's Gate episodes and play some Hands of Bridge over Zoom with my family. I expected it to be a slow news day. A no news day. The morning instead brought an explosion, both literal and of news. In my rush out the door after I heard about an early morning detonation downtown, I donned my down coat and a wool beanie, but mistakenly grabbed thin pink fleece gloves. For the third time in less than a year, I arrived to see a Nashville neighborhood covered in shattered glass. The water main was still broken when I showed up, arching above First Avenue on what on any other day would look like a festive dancing fountain. I stood on the east bank of the Cumberland River, my fingers blue and stiff, trying to process what happened. I've spent hundreds of hours on that bank, offering to take photos for tourists, getting ready to race dragon boats. And now I was processing that a bomb had intentionally been detonated, blowing apart historic Victorian facades, and along with them, the last hope I carried for a new year without broken glass. I evaluated where it was safe to stand, to whom I needed to ask questions, and how not to be in the way. A younger woman with her own press pass rushed up to me frantic, looking for a quote on her deadline, not seeing mine hanging from my neck, which was obscured by the bulk of my coat. To get home, I took a circuitous route, navigating closed bridges, staying away from barricades, driving through Salem Town and Germantown, still dotted with blue tarps, still waiting for repair post-tornado 9 months later. I attempted to avoid streets with broken glass, not wanting to pull debris out of what would have been my third flat tire that month. I walked back into my house, my fingers numb from the cold, hung up the press pass by the door, made my way to the bathroom, and threw up, unable to digest the grief, not just of the morning, but of the last year. Later, I'd learned that the bomber seemed to intentionally try to prevent others from being harmed, waking up residents by playing Petula Clark's Downtown and broadcasting warnings from the van that he turned into a detonation device. Later, I'd learned that he used coins as shrapnel, Historic preservation and cleanup crews later found pennies folded as easily as paper among the debris of the broken glass and crumbled brick. Later, I'd learn he acted alone. Later, I'd learn of the police officers who spent those pre-blast minutes moving at hyperspeed, evacuating still sleepy residents and their pets. But that was all later. The bombing knocked out internet and phone lines in the area, so I couldn't report on what I'd just seen. I learned nothing from the outside world that day, or the next, or the day after. There wasn't a constant chain of texts as there had been after the tornado, or at least not that I received. I occasionally turned on the radio for an update, but instead I sat and thought, and I walked and thought. I made egg rolls and kung pao tofu, although I didn't have much of an appetite. I thought about a trip Raja and I took to research a book chapter when infection rates dipped in the fall. I booked a room at the historic, remodeled Central Station Hotel Memphis, a design feat that melds history with modern influencer favorites with a rumbling train station. With only 8 rooms booked out of 123, we essentially had the place to ourselves, including the entire 8th floor, which made me feel like a character in the mixed up files of Mrs. Basilea Frankweiler. In the first floor restaurant, I was moved to tears, which didn't take much in 2020. Seeing the cracks in the sleek white subway tiles filled in with cracked gold grout, a nod to Japanese kintsugi or golden repair, allowing the flaws to be visible even as things are made whole again. I'd seen kintsugi on pottery before in vases and objects, but never in a building, much less one as storied as the Central Station Hotel, where millions of people have hurried through its hallways, catching trains to Chicago or New Orleans. I thought about the broken glass strewn about my city. I thought of the continued isolation, waiting for connectivity, waiting for answers, waiting for connection, waiting for vaccines. It had been a year of waiting, a year of depressed passes. I thought about the ways in which I was now cracked and broken, some of my glass left with all of my sources who had shared their suffering and their stories, parts of me left in the Weiss Liquors parking lot, both when the neon sign was felled and when it was restored to cheers from a grateful neighborhood. I left pieces on the Metro courthouse lawn, which had been transformed from the site of protest into a memorial for the then more than 500 Nashvillians who had died of COVID-19, each marked with a tiny white flag, a number that doubled within the next 6 months. It can't all be put back together like it was before, and I learned I don't want it to be. Now it and I will be kintsugi'd, ribbons of gold holding the broken parts together, showing our wounds, our blue tarped roofs, our cracked subway tiles, and all their names.
Thank you so much, Meg. That was beautiful. And such
Thank you for letting me tell the story, letting us all tell our stories.
Yeah, it was really just such a privilege and such a powerful experience to work on these pieces and to read them multiple times and think about them. And maybe the most meaningful thing that happened to me during pandemic, of course, which, now we're in 2021 and we didn't really anticipate sort of being where we are at this point, but here we are. Meg, I want to open this up to questions from you guys for each other and from anyone watching tonight too. So we'll be looking for those in the chat, but I'll kick things off by asking, Nick mentioned that he wrote his piece, prior to the call for submissions for an event, and Delaney, you drafted your piece in my class. Meg, with your piece, had you begun working on it before you found out about the anthology coming together, or did you sort of see this as a prompt?
I saw this as a prompt. Early early on when everything started in March 2020, I read somebody's advice on the internet, at that time where we couldn't get off the internet at all, that said we should write about what was going on so we wouldn't forget. And not that I think I could forget any of this, but I did sort of keep notes a lot throughout the year, and I wasn't really going to do anything with it. And when you first put out the call for essays and talked about what you wanted, at one point it said, make us laugh. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to do that. And then I just kept thinking about what I wanted to say. And so then I specifically wrote it for this anthology or for submission.
Well, I'm really glad that you did. It was, it really, I've loved having it. We, of course, as I mentioned, I think it's the last piece in the book, and kind of touching as it does on the Christmas bombing, I felt like that was the right place. But what you have to say about, the idea of kintsugi and sort of that as a metaphor for what we've gone through and who we are on the other side of it was just so perfect. So thank you.
Thank you.
Questions from you guys? Anybody have a question for one another?
I have a question for Nick, actually. I had the privilege of hearing Nick perform the same piece at our Reckoning launch party, which was last month, I think. And the contrast between the spoken word versus the written word is so interesting to me. In particular, I'm so curious about composition. As you're writing, are you writing out loud? And because the rhythm of these words and the rhymes that are like built into them, and the like using words that have multiple meanings, it's so clever and so well done. But I'm curious if you start putting words on a piece of paper, or if you're composing in text and then working orally, or vice versa.
Yeah, I usually just type them out on my computer. And then as I'm typing, I kind of stop and I'll say it to myself to make sure that it's, that it works okay. And like with something with the Bloom stage, when I know that I'm going to be performing it, my lines tend to be shorter to kind of help facilitate rhythm. But like if I'm writing like a sonnet or something, then I might, rhythm is important, but it's, I would want to make it more something that people are going to, I kind of write knowing that people are going to read it on the page more so than hear me perform it. So I always type it out first, but I'll stop every few lines if I know I'm going to perform it and say it to myself to make sure that it's heading in the right direction.
I've seen that you write a ton of haiku as well.
Yeah,
such an interesting use of such a classical format, or how many people these days are still counting syllables while they write is so interesting to me, and I think they're all so clever.
Thank you, I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun, and it's kind of cool when like people you're friends with on Twitter or something will write one, and they don't usually write them, but they're doing it just to join in the fun. So yeah, appreciate that with haikus.
We have an audience question. Especially during COVID, where you can't go out to many places and are stuck in your home, how do you get over writer's block? It's a great question. Delaney, do you want to take that one maybe, or?
I don't know if the difference between my bio and Margaret and Nick's bios is that I have no publications anywhere listed, because this is my first published piece. I'm 44 years old, and I'm really excited and proud to be doing this, and really hoping to continue putting effort into my writing future. It's an affirmation that I say out loud every night before bed. But so I kind of am speaking from the point of view of approximately 24 years of writer's block is how I would put that. Like basically since college, I all I do is write, Instagram posts and diaries. And so prompts are such an incredibly helpful tool to me, even if it's not something that I am initially thinking I'm going to connect with. I've created a huge list of prompts that I've shared with my writing group, that sometimes we'll pick a random one. We'll do a number randomizer and just pick a random one, even if we think it's not something we're ever going to connect with. I'm always so impressed with where your brain will go if you just let it, and just actually sit down and start doing the work, even if you don't like the idea of sitting down and knowing what I want to write about is very foreign to me and not something that I generally do. I mostly sit down to write and then figure out where it's going from there. So I think my answer to the question would be just write anyway, even if it's not what you're trying to be writing about, or even if you don't think you have anything to say that day, but it's just, it's a muscle that you have to just keep working, I think.
I mean, that's what deadlines are for. But one of the things that I try to do, because writer's block is in your head. It's not actually, it doesn't matter if you're in the most beautiful cabin designed for writing or at your office or whatever. But I do get up and move around. And I'm a little embarrassed to learn during this session that Delaney is my neighbor, because one of the things I did in the pandemic is I would just get up and walk a circle in my neighborhood. And that almost always helps me remember or figure out what I want to say. And as I mentioned in my essay, I use a dictation app. So I wrote a lot of things, or sort of sorted out a lot of things. And I'm sure looks like I'm talking to myself as I'm walking in a loop in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
You're definitely not the only Englewood neighbor who's talking to themselves while they're walking. Don't worry about that.
For me, I feel like I have such a backlog of things that I want to write that when I sit down, like something usually will tumble into the page, and it's not always good at first, but after about 5-6 minutes, I'm kind of going, I'm moving along, and my brain's going, and I don't really feel a lot of writer's block. I sometimes feel like what I'm writing is maybe not quite where I want it to be, but just in terms of not being able to say anything, that doesn't happen as often. So
it sounds like the sitting down and doing it and refusing to quit is a big part of it, even though you may not like what's coming out at first.
Right. Yeah.
There's another question for you, Nick. Could you talk about the intersection of being a comic and a poet? I love this question.
Yeah, this is a one that I've thought about a lot. Well, in performing, since I was doing poetry first, and poetry is very stylized, and you talk like this, and you don't even have to stare. You don't have to talk to the audience. You can kind of just stare into the abyss and just, but with comedy, and it took me a while to realize this, is that it's less stylized. It's more conversational. You need to make eye contact with the audience. You need to take your time a little bit more. And once I learned that, that's when my comedy started getting better, because if you're too stylized and you're doing comedy and then they don't laugh at your first couple jokes, it can get awkward. But you still got to keep doing your set, So for me, it was learning that comedy is more stylized. Poetry you can almost go into sort of a one-man show kind of mode, if that makes sense. Yeah. And writing, but in producing them, I feel like they're different, but I feel like you're using the same part of your brain. Even though some things are better for poetry than it is for comedy, some like topics. And whereas I think with comedic topics, there are no comedic topics that I don't think that cannot work for poetry, but there are certain things that, it's really difficult to make funny, but you can really make poetic and help people and communicate with people that way. So
I have so much respect for comedians. There's not a part of me that's going to be able to ever do that. So, yeah, I have a question for y'all. In terms of has there been any other? We're starting to see short stories and poems, and even movies. Maybe not movies yet, but that are taking on the pandemic. Sort of this time. I wonder, and of course, there's been writing all along in journals and newspapers. I wonder if you've read anything during this 18 months, pandemic related, that has really gripped you? I mean, are there particular writers covering it that have been important to you in terms of understanding or processing or any of that?
I mean, I loved reading things from perspectives that were so different from mine, to really see how people, I mean, I live alone and I was used to working from home before the pandemic. So in that way, so I had a very isolated experience, but also some of that wasn't wholly unfamiliar. So for me, it was really interesting to read about people who just were having completely different experiences, essential workers, people who were homeschooling. So I read a lot of those essays and journalist work, and loved all that.
Well, I mean, I feel like a lot of my reading about the pandemic just kind of came on social media, just seeing what people thought. I didn't really read any like books or long form pieces that I can remember. I mean, I did some virtual poetry readings, and heard people heard their poetry about it. But in terms of just actually sitting down and reading, I'm not sure I did a lot of that about the pandemic.
Yeah, it's still very early, like I don't know that I think there are starting to be some books, but it's still really early. I find I review lifestyle books for Book Page, and I'm starting to see now into the introductions of some of the books that are coming out in the next few months, they're all referencing pandemic, but of course the books themselves aren't about it. But I've also seen a lot of books about grief. And I found that really interesting, that that's definitely a trend, at least in the lifestyle market right now. So
I found a lot. I thought Modern Love column in New York Times did such an interesting job of putting the pandemic spin on love stories. There were a few examples of things where people were breaking up in the midst of the pandemic, or people were starting to date virtually, only over Zoom at first. I loved seeing those points of view too. I thought that was a really unique way to continue having this all be part of one big story.
I'll have to look those up. Yeah. Well, a few minutes ago, we got a 3-minute warning that we are coming to the end of our time together. So I guess we're going to close now. Feels like it went by super fast. Thank you all so much for being a part of this, everybody that's watching, and you guys on the panel with me. The book is available. You can order it from your local bookseller or from Amazon. There's, get it however you wish. You can order it directly from the porch. And just thank you again to everybody that helped make this a reality. And I hope you love it. And I hope it becomes meaningful in new ways over the coming years as you return to it. So thanks, guys, for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.